So this is the first part of our first case study, which is about the settler colony and the frontier, and this is the US-Mexico border. So the way that I organize the case studies is the first half is a history of the border, and the second half is a discussion around some of the contemporary issues around the border, applying some of the theory that we've talked about in the first couple of weeks. So this set of slides is really interested in the history of the US-Mexico border. There's a lot of content here. You don't need to remember all of it. I'm also happy to answer any questions and go over anything or talk about anything further that you might want to know about. We're going to talk about the origins of the US-Mexico border, and we're going to talk about the importance of parallel narratives, by which I mean there are multiple ways of telling this story, some of which are as accurate or as inaccurate as others, right? We're talking about two sides of a border. We're talking about multiple communities, not just two. We're talking about different national and imperial histories at play. We're going to talk about settler colonies as a kind of way of thinking about a type of colonialism and what settlement is and what settlers are, who settlers are. And then we're going to finish up with some of the more abstract stuff around the imaginative geographies of the frontier. This is kind of cultural representations of frontier imagery, frontier stories, frontier narratives. We'll tap into quite a bit of the material that comes out in Nature of Geographical Knowledge. So if you haven't taken that course yet, a lot of this stuff will appear imminently in NOGK. If you have taken that course, hopefully some of this stuff is familiar to you. So some background. This is a potted history of a really complex, long period of history. But very basically, in the 16th century, European exploration and resource extraction takes white Europeans from Europe to what is called the so-called New World. This is what corresponds now to North and South America. In 1492, right, Columbus arrives, the usual story, yada, yada, yada. The New World at this time is dominated by the Spanish and the French, who build an empire across much of what becomes North and South America and the Caribbean. And in the first instance, they're after bullion, which is the fancy word for gold, silver, and precious metals. It's only later that they start to build agricultural plantations on the backs of enslaved peoples brought over from Africa forcefully. And that is when sugar industry, cotton industry, tobacco industry appear. So a key point in the history of the Spanish Empire, the Spanish conquest of Mexico is generally understood to be the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, which happens between 1519 and 1521. This is really early. This is a really early period in European colonialism. And this is the base, essentially Mexico is the base for later conquests of other regions in Central and South and North America. So this is kind of a period of protracted campaigns, protracted conflict and violence instigated by Spanish conquistadors. So you have the Spanish conquest of the Yucatan, the Spanish conquest of Guatemala, the War of Mexico's West, and the Chichimeca War in northern Mexico, which expand Spanish control over the territory and also expand their control over indigenous populations. It's not really until the Spanish conquest of Peru, further south, that the Spanish Empire becomes its kind of self on the map. And this is when the Spanish decimate the Inca Empire, and this is in 1532. Hernan Cortés is perhaps the most famous of the conquistadors. He leads the conquest against the Aztec Empire, extremely violent period in Spanish history and in the history of the so-called New World in the Americas. He has a little bit of assistance as well from some of the indigenous city-states. So there's something really interesting, of course, that happens in colonialism where there's negotiation and there's alliance between indigenous peoples and indigenous leadership and European conquerors and European officials. This doesn't mean that indigenous peoples consent to imperial or colonial rule. It just means that at certain times, certain rulers and certain people in positions of power will have seen an opportunity to potentially advance themselves. The Kingdom of New Spain is established by Charles V in 1535, and this is the moment where the Spanish Empire in the New World kind of is completed. So 1535, really important moment. What's really interesting, and what I'll draw your attention to, is this is very early in the New World, in the conquering of the New World, relative to the United States, for example, and the British colonization of North America. Spain colonized and exerted control of Alta California through the Spanish missions in California, which is where I'm from. So my history is Mexican history until 1849. Mexico declares independence in 1833. So eventually Mexico declares independence from the Spanish Empire and becomes an independent country. And it's that country that we're talking about when we talk about the US-Mexico border. It's really important to remember that the United States isn't the only former and current colonial power at play in the region. Mexico also has a colonial history. There are power imbalances at play, of course, and there's absolutely racial ideologies at work. But it's really important that we remember that the Spanish and the British and the French are all at work in this region at various points over the many centuries in which the US-Mexico border is coming into being. Spain manages to win conflicts with the Aztecs and the Mayas in this region, and the Incas further south. And the Aztecs are essentially an alliance between different tribal groups. They aren't a single indigenous group. They're an alliance of multiple tribal groups that share generally language and culture. And they're organized around a set of federalized city-states. Remember, we talked about city-states when we talked about Thomas Nail's conception of the wall. Further north, in what becomes the border region, lies the historic homelands of the Apache tribes. And this is a group of indigenous tribal peoples. This is a Spanish map of an area of Navajo Apache territory in present-day Utah. Of course, Utah is now in the United States. The Apache territory extended through massive tracts. There was a ton of territory that was held by the Apache tribes. And remember, according to the settlers, this region is a frontier. So all of this region is borderlands, if we use Nail's thinking, for about a century. So this is all borderland. It's borderland according to the United States, and it's borderland according to the Spanish and eventually the Mexicans. This massive region is essentially one big border. It's a frontier. The areas up to nearly Canada and from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean are all frontier, by which I mean they're contested territory. Meanwhile, the British, big conflict back home between the British and the Spanish in a maritime war, etc. By the 16th century, British privateers, fancy word for state-funded pirates, are intercepting Spanish ships and stealing gold. Guys like Sir Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, John Hawkins. This is dramatization, Assassin's Creed Black Flag, in which you play as a pirate from Wales. Elizabeth I gets really interested in exploration, and this is partly to challenge the efforts of her rival European monarchs, right? The Spanish are already out in the New World. They're already digging up tons of gold. They're conquering vast masses of territory using extremely violent means. Explorers are sent out looking for the Northwest Passage. And while they fail at that because it's not a thing, they do learn a lot about geography, and this sets the stage for settlement. This is the Waldseemüller map. I think I may have shown it to you before in various other courses, and it's the first to show the so-called New World. Waldseemüller names what is the Western Hemisphere. He names it the Americas after the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci. Colonies are established, yada, yada, yada. Economies begin to build, settlement expands. Really important, but we don't have that much space to talk about it. Enslavement becomes a key part of the economies in this region. 1776, quite famous War of Independence. By 1781, the United States is established. George Washington is established as the first president. A constitution is drafted and ratified, and the colonies become states. This is Mel Gibson in The Patriot. I just think this is, an incredible GIF. Colonies are starting to establish themselves as independent states. Haiti comes really early, which is established after a slave uprising. And we start to see distinct forms of nationalism appear in the new nation states. So if you've taken a course with me before, you may be familiar with Benedict Anderson. He gives us a really interesting and important theory to describe nationalism when he calls the nation an imagined community. So he says that the nation is an imagined political community. It's imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. So it has clear limited boundaries. It isn't all the territory, it is a specific territory, and it is sovereign. It's imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members. You have to pretend like you have an affinity for them because you haven't met them. Most people won't meet them or even hear of them. Yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. Communities are to be distinguished not by their falsity or genuineness, but by the style in which they are imagined. And finally, the nation is imagined as a community because regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. Ultimately, it is this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many millions of people not so much to kill as willing to die for such limited imaginings. And I think really importantly as well, the willingness to send fellow citizens to die for such imaginings. And to think a little bit beyond the nation as an imagined community, Edward Said gives us this concept of imaginative geography. And he says that cultures, particularly cultures in positions of power, create imaginative geographies about other places in order to explain them. And all of these imaginative geographies come to a certain extent from experience of or knowledge of, sometimes scientific knowledge, sometimes literary knowledge, sometimes artistic knowledge of a place. And he says it's important to remember that all cultures do impose corrections upon raw reality, changing it from free-floating objects into units of knowledge. And the problem isn't that that conversion takes place. It's perfectly natural for us to resist the assault on our minds of untreated strangeness, so that cultures have always been inclined to impose transformations on other cultures, as in, cultures have always been inclined to create stories and narratives about other cultures, receiving them not as they are, but as, for the benefit of the receiver, they ought to be. And this is an imaginary that exists in the minds, for example, of the colonizers. What's important is that this process of conversion is a disciplined one. It's taught. It has its own societies, periodicals, traditions, vocabulary, rhetoric, all in basic ways connected to and supplied by the prevailing cultural and political norms of the West. So geography, for example, we have the RGS, the Royal Geographical Society. We have a set of geographical journals that we publish in. There are traditions that we follow and practices that we all participate in. We use a particular vocabulary, right? There are words that we use, space and place, nature, culture, right? We use a particular rhetoric as well, all in basic ways that are designed to facilitate our Western European way of thinking about the world. Said says what's really important is that this process is totalizing. So it erases the possibility for correction by the culture that is being impacted upon. So it erases the ability for a kind of set of cultural norms or a set of cultural knowledges that may not be a part of a European imaginative geography of the New World, for example. It erases the possibility for the New World to respond, to talk back. So in the 19th century, we have 2 sets of imaginative geographies at work. both of which have colonial origins. New Spain versus the United States. One thing I've tried to do is show maps from Mexico and maps from Spain, Spanish language maps, as a way of demonstrating that there are multiple narratives and multiple cartographic imaginaries at work in this region. Often in the news media, we'll see maps drawn from a US American or a British perspective. I think it's really important that we talk about the fact that there are lots of different maps that were made by different groups of people to represent the territory. Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States, there he is on the left. A founding father, but not a hero necessarily. He was fascinated by geography, and he had this particular imaginary in his mind that was all about territorial symmetry. He believed in symmetry across disciplines, and he believed specifically in this thing called continental symmetry. He wanted to unite the continent of North America under the United States, so that the United States owned all of the territory between the coasts. And he first wanted to explore and understand and find a passage across the continent. In 1803, he purchases a massive tract of land from the French Empire. This is called the Louisiana Purchase. And he sends two explorers, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, and their team, which is made up of a group of U.S. Army volunteers who called themselves, not ironically, the Corps of Discovery, in 1804 to find the Pacific Ocean. So in 1803 and 1804, they're given the task of exploring and mapping the newly acquired territory to find a practical route across the western half of the continent and to establish an American presence in this territory before Britain and other European powers tried to claim it. There were secondary objectives here as well that, of course, were scientific and economic, and it is these secondary objectives that have become part of the American nationalist mythology surrounding the Lewis and Clark expedition. They were to study the area's plants, the animal life, the geography. They were also told to establish trade with local indigenous tribes. The expedition returned to St. Louis to report its findings to Jefferson, and they had maps and sketches and journals in hand. Really important to acknowledge, of course, Sacagawea's contribution. They're pretty successful. This is one of the maps that they produce, and a lot of their success had to do with indigenous native knowledge. And most famous is Sacagawea. She was the quote-unquote wife of a French-Canadian explorer and trader who was part of the expedition. It's unclear exactly what her relationship to him was. She was a key interpreter and cultural translator, and she provided some assurance to indigenous tribes as the expeditions passed through their lands, which gained them access. They created a ton of maps and surveys. They collected a ton of geographical material. They assisted the U.S. government in creating a more accurate understanding of the topography, the relationship between the mountain ranges and rivers, the natural resources available in the western part of the territory. And Jefferson has them claim the land and declare American sovereignty. And the maps produced become the basis for further exploration and eventual settlement and administration. So alongside this sort of scientific work of Lewis and Clark, there's the development of an ideology of American exploration, an American authority, an American power. And this ideology holds that the United States has a God-ordained right to expand its territory west. And it achieves its zenith in the phrase manifest destiny, which is coined in 1845, and connects the far west, which is California, Oregon, Washington, to the ideal and necessary future of the United States. So in terms of practical application of manifest destiny, President James Polk, he becomes president in 1845, and this is a key year for U.S. American history. He becomes president in 1845 on the back of a campaign slogan, 54 degrees 40 or fight. 54 degrees 40 is a reference to the latitude of the northern border of Oregon. So he's claiming he wants Oregon. but he really wants California. Meanwhile, the US has been busy filling in its missing pieces. So it's acquired Spanish lands in the southeast, including Florida. It's been promoting a program of settlement to the Texas territory, which at the time was part of New Spain. We'll talk more about Texas in just a couple of minutes. Meanwhile, in Mexico, Mexico achieves independence from Spain in 1821, and Mexico is massive and unwieldy. The capital is located in Mexico City, and because of this, far northern regions are consistently difficult to control, particularly because of regular native raids and indigenous resistance, but also because the United States and the British have eyes on a lot of this territory. Texas. As a Californian, Texas is super weird to me. I will never fully understand it, but Texas is key. So Texas and California are both flashpoints here. The United States government wants them both, and Mexico holds them. So conflicts in Texas between white settlers from the east and earlier Hispanic and Latino settlers from the south are part of the settlement of Texas. So white U.S. settlers become a majority, and Texas declares independence from Mexico. It's really important here to note that the United States has a settlement program. They are advertising Texas to white settlers from the east, and they are supporting white settlers to move into Texas so that they can eventually take Texas from Mexico. Mexico does not recognize Texas's independence. And this is really key. Texas is independent for a while, which Texans always like to remind you about. Mexico doesn't recognize Texas's independence, but it has trouble enforcing its laws. And in 1836, Texas becomes a de facto republic. In 1845, the Texas government allows Texas to be annexed by the United States, which provides the first glimpse of a new southern border with Mexico. And the border between Texas and Mexico is really important. The annexation of Texas by the United States is a really important moment. This starts a war between two of the three independent settler nation states in North America. This is called the Mexican-American War, and some historians say that this was President Polk's plan all along, that he wanted to start a war with Mexico in order to gain the Southwest for the United States. And in 1847, General Winfield Scott takes Mexico City, that's what this is, and the United States, so-called, wins the war. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, really important treaty in U.S. American history, one of the most important documents ever signed in 1848. And this agrees the peace between the U.S. and Mexico. Really important for us as geographers studying the border, 525,000 square miles of Mexico are ceded to the United States, including the land that makes up all or parts of Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. That is a huge tract of land. Mexico also gave up claims to Texas, recognized the Rio Grande, which is a river, as America's southern boundary, and in return, the United States paid Mexico $15 million and agreed to settle all claims of U.S. citizens against Mexico. What a deal. So at this point, I'd recommend you take a bit of a break. The next bit is where we're going to talk about the Boundary Commission and the formation of the boundary, roughly in a form that we might recognize today. So take a couple of minutes, take 24 hours, take a week, however long you want. Come back when you've got a cup of tea, maybe some Maltesers, and we'll talk about the border. Have you done it? Have you taken a break? Yeah? All right, let's go. So, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. A map is appended to the treaty, which is a map of the survey of the U.S.-Mexico borderline. This survey followed the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It is a ridiculous story. So it took forever to conduct this survey. It was plagued by political intrigue, deaths from starvation and yellow fever, struggles for survival in the desert, the constant threat of violent attacks by indigenous peoples, and filibusters, which meant that no side could agree or negotiate. Yet, truth be told, the mid-19th century survey of the 2,000-mile border was a story of heroism, skill, and endurance of epic proportions. It's really quite interesting. Though the survey lacked the glamour of war, and it certainly lacked the grandeur of the Lewis and Clark expedition, it wasn't great for PR. But the Boundary Survey is one of the most fascinating and significant events in U.S. political history, and it remains deeply present in our contemporary lives. And it's specifically really important in the United States and in Mexico. Michael Dear, who is a very famous geographer based at UCLA, says that this map depicts a narrative of nation building, which was centered in President Polk's vision of manifest destiny. So the Joint United States and Mexico Boundary Commission, it comes together in 1849. This is the kind of height of territorial ambitions and imaginings of the border on both sides. And ideas of the nation and feelings and symbolism of the nation are absolutely wrapped up in this territory. The negotiators of the treaty didn't really know anything about the geography and the territory of the region they were carving up, and this is a trend that will come back to haunt us in pretty much every other border context we might study. So a lot of the agreement actually didn't make any sense on the ground. Diplomats tend to draw lines for political reasons, but making the border on the ground is a totally different process. And so for geographers and surveyors, making the border on the ground match a certain political map is often really difficult, if not impossible. The survey finishes in 1855, and it's finished with the signing of the Gadsden Treaty. But surveys are continuing to be conducted throughout the rest of the 19th century, and there is constant territorial negotiation, there's constant correcting of errors, and the boundary really isn't set, not until the 20th century. I should also add here, it's really important to remember that a lot of this region is the territorial homeland of the Apache tribes. So if you remember a few slides ago, we talked about the relationship between the Apache tribes and the Spanish colonial government in Mexico City. The Apache tribes haven't gone anywhere. They're still there, and they're defending their territory in many different ways. And it is important to remember that that is still the homeland of the Apache tribes. They were mostly moved onto reservations in a very violent period of colonial American history. And the Apache and Hopi tribes still exist as sovereign nations in the American Southwest. So this is the first introduction to boundary making and the theory of boundary making. We'll talk about this again when we talk about partition. Boundary making happens in 3 steps, and this is codified at the turn of the century. So boundary makers and geographers and politicians who are interested in this kind of create a set of standardized practices around boundary making. So first is delimitation. This is basically drawing the boundaries on the map. The second is demarcation, which is marking out the boundary on the ground. And the third is maintenance, and this is political and physical. Maintenance happens in the contemporary moment, right? So we've been talking about the delimitation and the demarcation stages. In the next set of slides, we're going to talk about the maintenance stages. Standard history tends to forget the second and third in the border making process on the ground. So historians tend to be really interested in the politics of the delimitation stage. Who wanted what territory? Who wouldn't budge on what piece of territory? Who was sitting in the room at the time? But historians aren't really that interested in the demarcation and the maintenance stages. Whereas a lot of border studies tends to forget the first and the second. So a lot of border studies scholars tend to focus on the maintenance of the border, the way that the border works in contemporary context. But some of us find the second, demarcation, to be the most interesting stage, and it's usually the one that everybody forgets about. So Michael Dear, geographer, argues that the monuments erected by the Boundary Survey played a pivotal role in securing the line after the Mexican-American War. They're made up of obelisks and stone mounds, and they literally marked on the ground the southernmost edges of the nation. They became fundamental points of reference in subsequent boundary disputes, of which there were many, and in the resurvey of the border that took place at the end of the 19th century. And this sort of forgetting of the second stage in boundary making, I like to think of as being like what Benedict Anderson calls an amnesia related to nationalism. So one of the key points of Anderson's work in Imagined Communities is the idea that a nationalist consciousness represents a profound change in how people start to think about themselves. They start to think about themselves as having a particular national identity that is very much cultural and linguistic. And he says that these profound changes in consciousness, by their very nature, bring with them characteristic amnesias, or a process of forgetting. And out of such oblivions come narratives. So we only have partial or piecemeal historical records and historical narratives about what actually happened and how the border was made. And because we only have a kind of partial historiography, we then have on top of that the arrival and the creation of very powerful, very strong narratives or stories about the border. And these are not the same thing as a kind of historical narration of the past. They're far more symbolic. They tend to embrace forms of nationalist myth-making. And he says, out of this estrangement, this kind of loss of historical memory, comes a conception of personhood or identity, a nationalist personhood or a national identity, which can't be remembered because we don't have the entire historical story. It must be narrated. And these types of border stories, these border narrations, are really important in the contemporary moment. So we'll talk about some of the most powerful border imaginaries in the next set of slides and in a lot of the materials that I've provided you on Learn. The next thing you should do is go and take a look at the Red Dead Redemption 2 trailer. I've posted the YouTube video in the Learn page. Have a look and you can start to see how stories about the Wild West and stories about the US American frontier are a mixture of historical fact and historical fantasy. And you can start to see the imaginative geographies of the frontier at work in Red Dead Redemption 2. And we see a lot of these Wild West imaginaries at work in descriptions of the border as well. The US-Mexico border is often referred to as a Wild West or as a final frontier. And it's really important that we're able to recognize that all of those fantasies and mythologies, whether they are historically accurate or quote unquote true or not, doesn't matter. Those fantasies are extremely powerful narratives for creating contemporary understandings of what happens at the US-Mexico border, who the people are who live in the borderland regions and who cross the border, and what the landscape means for those who live there or who traverse the region.